reboots. And why are there so many of them? And why are they mostly bad? So I recently saw this article that there's about 28 to 30 reboots coming, and I just don't understand why there's so many of them all the time. I kind of feel like we're always talking about something being rebooted. And you know, it makes sense when it's at least something like Jane Eyre or something like that, something that's a little bit more classic than a Freaky Friday remake, for example. We're kind of more familiar with the 2003 edition, so I'm not sure, maybe for previous generation it's a little bit different. Maybe they remember the 76 version better. I only know the 2003 version. When I think of Freaky Friday, I think of that version, but it can be different for somebody else. It also originally was a story, a book, then it was turned into the first movie. And it makes sense with the first movie. You're like, okay, well, there was a story, they wanted to make a movie out of it. It makes sense that there is a film about it. It's not a remake, it's just the first film, right? This film was at about 70% in terms of critical acclaim. The budget was $5 million and they have gotten $36 million in the box office. It's not too bad at all. And then we get another movie, which is straight to TV adaptation. There's so little information online about it. There's no information about what the budget was like. There's no information about how much money this film made. No ratings information either. It's just so strange because, well, what was the point? What was the point of making this? Let's just skip ahead to the next adaptation, which is the 2003 version of Freaky Friday, which again didn't do too bad in terms of box office. The budget was $26 million. They made $160 million. It's pretty good. And also the critical acclaim is the highest out of all adaptations. Because guess what? This is not the last adaptation. This is the last one that I remember, but there's two more. One TV adaptation, straight to TV. It's a musical. It's kind of terrible. You can tell just by the cover. In general, there's not a lot of people who praise this movie. It's kind of strange that it was made. There was no need for it, but at least there's kind of an explanation for its existence, that they have changed something about it, right? That they created a musical. It was the lowest rated premiere of the last decade on Disney Channel in like 10 years. So it makes no sense that why did you even make it? Because the thing is, they have the rights to the story. They can just show the movie again. It's just puzzling because it just makes no sense. There's also another one which is Freaky, a horror story twist. It's just forgettable as well, so it's not even worth discussing. With this movie, the question is it because of money, right? Or not even with this movie specifically, but with a lot of remakes. The explanation that we usually get from people when we all discuss why remakes are so common, it's just interesting that they keep on going with it. So it must be money, right? This is kind of like the answer that everyone gives you if you ask why are there so many remakes. Money. It's an easy money grab. There's name recognition and whatever. But then when you actually look into it, it doesn't seem to be correct. So let's dissect the money explanation, right? So while I was looking into it, I found this article about remakes that made less than the original. And at first I thought that maybe it's gonna be a bunch of examples of the remakes that made less money, but it kind of is more than that, because we talk about this inflation adjusted 100 highest grossing movies of all time, and in that list with the inflation adjustment, there is literally not a single movie that's a remake that's in the top 100. So it's definitely not a type of money grab that makes a lot of sense, because it never actually goes beyond the first movie, the original movie's success, which would be fine if it at least justified the amount of money that was spent on that movie. And right now I'm not talking about sequels, right? So sequels, of course, they're kind of using the recognition of the original name, building upon something that's already been popular. So for example, like Star Wars or any of the Harry Potter adjacent movies, they're all gonna be either sequels, prequels, stories of other characters from the world. It's not exactly the same as a remake. A remake, however, we have a bunch of examples here where the inflation adjusted numbers are included, and it kind of gives you this more realistic image of what this movie's achieved. Because when I was looking up the numbers, I would look up the numbers of the box office, I would look up the numbers of the budget, but the truth is there's been a big inflation between those previous movies and the new ones. Usually there is, not always, because sometimes, like for example with the example of Gossip Girl, there's only been 9 years between the first show and the second one, the remake, being made. I guess it's not really exactly a remake as much as it's a reboot or a sequel, so it doesn't really count in the same way. There's only been 9 years in between, and those kinds of shows are very similar in general. So let's take a look at the first movie that this article gives an example of, which is The Karate Kid. So the amount of money that this movie made domestically was $90.8 million, which with the inflation adjustment would be 198 million. And then with the remake, you see 176 million dollars, which seems like a really high number, a lot higher of a number than 90.8 million. So if you were just to look it up and you would just compare the numbers, you'd be like, oh, of course they made a lot more money. Of course it would make sense to go back and remake this movie because you're gonna get so much money, such a big margin difference. But when you look at the inflation adjustment number, it's 183.5 million dollars, which if you do the math, which is already done in this article for us, it's 14.5 million dollars. It actually made less money than that movie. Of course, 183 million dollars is still a lot of money, but it seems a little strange. It would be so much easier to just make a new movie. Maybe not easier, it would be so much more interesting to make a new movie. It would be more interesting to get a new audience. I feel like it's also one of those things where the movie definitely got more views, got more recognition because of the stars involved. If they would have had a different cast of people who nobody knows, I don't know if they would do as well. I also remember, wasn't it the same movie that used that Never Say Never song or something like that, Justin Bieber? Basically, they just threw a bunch of heavyweights of cultural conversation at that time, of pop culture, and that's why they've made this amount of money, and it's still less than the original. The next one we're gonna look at is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The original one made 30.9 million and the remake made 80.6 million, but the inflation flips the numbers once again. We get 141.9 million for the original and 99.2 million for the remake. It's 32.8 million difference between the remake and the original. So it made a lot less money and the budget was very different. So for the remake, the budget was a lot higher. What was the point? Conan the Barbarian, there's literally an insane difference. $71 million difference. The remake made $71 million less. And it's insane because it had a $90 million budget. It was such a flop. Let's look at Halloween, a classic in horror genre, probably the first film you're gonna watch in film studies in the horror chapter of your class. If we look at the money, already inflation adjusted, we get 163.3 million versus 63.7 million. There's literally $100 million difference in terms of how much money the second film made. The original was made with a very small budget because of course it was. Horror movies, if it's the first installment, it's always going to be very low budget. It's kind of the reason why most of young directors' careers start with horror movies, because they're so cheap to compare to everything else. It's just so strange that they keep on doing this. This last one is just ridiculous. It's Arthur, the 81 version and the 2011 version, and the difference between them is $205 million. That's insane. Isn't that insane? I know that this is just a few examples, but as we've talked about it, it's definitely an indicator that the money is not exactly there. Because if the company has that much money to have the rights to that very popular movie and the money to have a budget for that second installment or a remake for it, that means that that company can afford a marketing campaign. That means that that company can afford a good production team. That means that if they have that kind of budget, they can have stars that will bring more people to watch it. There's no need to be clinging to that story unless, and this is what we're gonna go into next, is we have appropriation art approach to movies going on. So appropriation art, it's usually used for contemporary or conceptual art to describe this type of approach where the pre-existing objects or images with little or no transformation applied to them are used in a new piece of art. So it's kind of the same in terms of writing. If you take the story and you don't really change that much about it, which is a remake, but then you add more in terms of recontextualization, then you kind of get a reason to remake something with more of a noble and more of an interesting reason to do so instead of just money. You can kind of see that with some movies where the genre would be changed. So from drama you would go into a horror retelling of the story. There is a difference between the aesthetic sometimes. Sometimes it could be placed in a different decade. If you're remaking something that was more modern, you can put it in like 16th century and remake the entire story to be within the new context of a new era. And it would kind of explain why you would want to remake something. A different historical context would give you a lot of different things to work with, which usually includes a different main lead that has maybe some similarities in terms of the root problems or root causes for their story to be a thing, but they would have a different appearance or a different relationship to the world around them. So this is more of a better reason to remake something, but it's still not always needed, and most of the time it's done poorly. Most of the time it's because the creators, for some reason, reason, even though they care enough about the story to remake it, don't actually understand it that well. So we've seen that, for example, with Heathers. It's mostly because I think that they were going, I don't know, I think they were trying to do Riverdale again, and Heather's main concept of the original movie is really hard to get remade right, especially when you change the context. And if you don't change the context, you're just remaking the movie shot for shot, and what's the point, right? So I understand that they were trying to make some creative changes to kind of approach this new era of teenagers in a new way and try to explore how it's unique to compare to the previous movie that was set in the 80s. But the fact of the matter is they completely misunderstood the dynamics of the new generation. It heavily relies on parental assessment of the teenagers instead of assessment of the teenagers in general. It feels like it's somebody who is from a position of power and distance assesses this kind of relationship that teenagers have, but not observing them all together as much as they just have a perspective of one teenager who's kind of retelling their perspective of it to them, and that teenager is not particularly very socially conscious, so it kind of gets very warped. I feel like maybe one of the writers or one of the producers, the one who decided to create this story or this remake, had a child, and they told them that this is how the world works, and they just took their word for it. It feels very warped, and it feels like it's warped on both ends of whoever they were observing and whoever was writing things down to retell them, because it just makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, and it feels like they completely misunderstood the original and the appeal of the original. I think that it's kind of like watching this movie with somebody who's not quite understanding that you're not supposed to like anybody in there, but also you're supposed to still understand or see them as real people acting weird rather than caricatures. They still feel real, they just feel very sinister, whereas in this kind of remake they feel very fake, so you just don't have any investment in them whatsoever. And also the whole core of Heathers was the reality of uncovering your own ego and its influence on you. This is kind of a very classic tale of being a teenager who's very idealistic and quite maximalistic about their approach to life, and them learning through experience that people they thought were the same with them are not quite the same, and that basically JD is a great character because he's so creepy in terms of getting to know him as one person from the perspective of Veronica, which is usually how girls experience guys, even those that are kind of sinister like JD in their teenagehood, and then finding out how creepy he is. And it's kind of a very familiar feeling to a lot of girls to find out that a guy is kind of scary, and I think that was kind of the core of the relatability of the story. Even though it's quite insane, it is rooted in something that we've all experienced. But this remake is of course just a Riverdale 2.0, 3.0, 15.0. It's sickening how firm of a grasp the creators of Riverdale have on the teenage shows industry right now because of just the sheer numbers that Riverdale was doing. It's really sad because the amount of shows that people get just because they are somehow related to Riverdale or they want to kind of get that success again. It's really bad because Riverdale wasn't good to begin with. So all of these remakes and all of these approaches to stories through the lens of Riverdale will always feel cringy and just not good. And it's not going to be something that will enhance our popular culture in any kind of way. It's going to be just a waste of time and resources. It's so wasteful. And then we also get this new announcement about Clueless, for example. It is described as a baby pink and bisexual blue tinted, tiny sunglasses wearing oat milk latte and fueled look at what happens when the high school queen bee Cher disappears and her lifelong number one Dion steps into Cher's vacant Air Jordans. First of all, Air Jordans for Cher? Are you kidding me? Is this a joke? I sure as hope they're joking because Air Jordans for Cher? Sickening. This smells of Heathers, of the remake. It smells like it. It smells like creators of Riverdale having something to do with it again. Ugh, this just doesn't sound good. And I hope that it's going to be the same situation as with Heathers, if they're going to actually get to production and to release it, that people are going to be so not impressed that they're just going to have to drop it and it's just going to be forgotten immediately, because I don't want Clueless to get tainted by something this ridiculous. The explanation of it, like, they want to be on trend. They want to be timely. They want to comment on the current state of society or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, you are producing a show. As when you're gonna start making it, it's gonna be 2020. You want to make a show about 2020. 2021, when you actually release it, it's gonna be a very different time. Right now, our culture moves at the speed of light. It's so fast. You cannot be constantly putting all of the relevance and all of the interest in your show onto the timely aspects, because you're gonna be always off, even when you want to. For example, the oat milk latte, whatever fueled look. Are you Tanamoju? Are you a lame kind of never on trend YouTuber? Why are you doing this? I don't get it. It's just not a good idea. They said that it's the new Clueless is Mean Girls meets Riverdale meets Lizzo music video. Can you tell I'm tired? I am so sick and tired of people just misunderstanding what the point of the original work was and why it withstood time. With Heathers, for example, the terms that they use when they talk to each other, which is the slang of the movie, was created for the movie itself. It's not the slang that was used at the time. That's why to this day it sounds both kind of weird and it still sounds totally fine. It doesn't sound like it is cringy, because it is a fictional high school world, a fictional world with all of those words that they came up with that only exist in the world of Heathers. If you take it out of the context and you put it into something else, and you put all of this slang that's current, it's not going to be current when you release it, first of all, and it's not going to be good, second of all, because people are going to feel this slight lagging in your understanding of the current moment. It's always going to be slightly laggy. So let's talk about the last reason that could explain why there's so many remakes, and this is technological advances after years from the original, which would make a little bit more sense. So it's, for example, things like old movies that are very fantasy based and they had to rely on a lot of practical effects that don't look as good anymore, obviously, because we're moving at a speed of light in terms of our progression, in terms of what we can make look real on screen. Sometimes it still doesn't work because the CGI is not really good or the budget wasn't the same, but in general it would make more sense that you would want to remake it. So for example, with Sailor Moon Crystal, it makes a lot of sense that it's being remade, even though the first two seasons were absolutely terrible in terms of proportions and other things like that. I don't know who signed off on it, on all of the proportions and all the directorial decisions. I know that the creators really love Sailor Moon, but they really didn't get some of the things right. But at the same time, Sailor Moon Crystal really got their stride in third season and right now in the Eternal movie in terms of the animation and everything, and it makes sense that they want to remake it because there are two reasons for it. First of all, the original anime wasn't following the manga very closely, so it kind of makes sense that they would want to give the animation a second chance. And second of all, this is definitely more appropriate 25 years after the original was released to start making a new one, because animation has progressed so much that it makes more sense. In any case, these are kind of the reasons for remakes and why I think that most of them don't actually work. It's kind of not a full view, but this is kind of what I came up with right now. Let me know what you think, and I'm really sorry for the sound in this video today because it's really loud outside for some reason. There's so many cars and there's also sounds from the outside of my room too. I hope you can't hear it that much. I hope my voice is kind of blocking it out, but if it doesn't, I'm really sorry. I will see you next time with a styling video actually. Thank you for watching. Bye!